The rain hammered against the mansion windows as billionaire heiress Claire Whitmore stepped quietly into her childhood home 2 days earlier than expected. She expected silence. Instead, she heard laughter coming from her mother's room upstairs. Her heart tightened. Since her father died, dozens of men had tried to take advantage of her lonely, elderly mother, charming smiles hiding greedy intentions. Furious, Claire stormed toward the bedroom, ready to throw the man out. But when she pushed the door open, she froze in disbelief. The struggling single father she once mocked was kneeling beside her mother, gently braiding the old woman's silver hair while reading her favorite book aloud. Claire Whitmore had built her entire life on the belief that the world was transactional. Every relationship had a price. Every smile had a motive. Every man who came close to her family eventually revealed what he truly wanted, and what he wanted was never love. She had learned that lesson at 23, standing in a courtroom, watching a man her widowed mother had trusted drain half the family's estate through a carefully worded contract no one had bothered to read closely enough. Claire had read it afterward, every single line, her jaw tightening with each page. She had vowed then that she would never be caught unprepared again. She built a company from a modest inheritance into a $2 billion empire in less than a decade. She wore power the way other women wore perfume naturally, without thinking, and it lingered long after she left a room. Her board of directors feared her. Her competitors respected her. Her employees admired her from a careful distance. No one got close. That was the design. That was the protection. Her father, Richard Whitmore, had died when Claire was 19. A heart attack on a Tuesday morning. Utterly without warning. The kind of death that offers no ceremony and no preparation. He had been the warmth between Claire and her mother, Eleanor the interpreter between two women who loved each other but rarely knew how to say so. Without him, they became polite strangers, sharing a house and a last name. Claire left for business school. Eleanor rattled around the 12-room estate in Connecticut with 3 staff members, and a garden she slowly stopped tending. The loneliness settled into Eleanor, the way cold settles into old bones, not dramatically, not all at once, but permanently, altering everything it touched. Men had noticed. Over the years, a steady rotation of gentlemen callers appeared at the estate. Retired professionals, widowers with too much charm and too little conscience. A financial advisor who had miraculously managed to lose 12% of Eleanor's portfolio over 18 months, while his own account grew. Claire had fired him personally, standing in her mother's sunroom. Using the kind of quiet voice that made people understand yelling would actually be preferable. She'd installed a new property manager, reviewed all accounts quarterly, and instructed the household staff to report any unfamiliar visitors immediately. The flight from Geneva had been 14 hours, and Claire had spent most of it reviewing quarterly projections and answering messages she'd been deferring for 3 days. She had been in Europe finalizing a merger that would expand her logistics portfolio into 6 new markets. A deal 2 years in the making that had required 4 trips, 11 rounds of negotiation, and one very uncomfortable dinner with a Swiss banker who believed women in business were a charming novelty. The merger was signed. Claire was coming home early, unannounced, because she trusted surprises far more than scheduled visits. Surprises showed people as they actually were. The car from the airport turned onto the long gravel driveway just as the rain started in earnest, the kind of November rain that felt personal, that seemed designed specifically to soak through your coat before you made it from the car to the front door. The estate glowed with warm light from the upper windows. Claire noticed that immediately the lights on a Thursday evening at 9 o'clock. When Eleanor typically retired by 8, she paid the driver, declined the umbrella from her assistant, and walked to the front door with her carry-on trailing behind her, raindrops running down the back of her neck. Thomas, the household manager who had worked for the Whitmore family for 19 years, opened the door before she reached the top step. He was a compact, gray-haired man of 61 who had survived every storm the family had produced with the steady equanimity of someone who had decided long ago that composure was his primary professional offering. But when he saw Claire standing in the rain a full 2 days before her expected return, something flickered across his face that was not composure. It was something closer to alarm. "Miss Whitmore," he said, stepping aside quickly. "We weren't expecting you until Saturday." "I know," Claire said, handing him her wet coat. "That's the point." She was already looking toward the staircase. From somewhere above, she could hear it, the low, warm sound of laughter. Her mother's laughter. A sound Claire had not heard in years, not genuinely, not like this, and it landed in her chest with a strangeness she couldn't quite name. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and listened. And what she felt was not relief. What she felt was suspicion. She took the stairs two at a time. The hallway on the second floor was lined with framed photographs of the family's summer vacations, Christmas mornings, the kind of evidence of happiness that a house accumulates over decades. Claire barely glanced at them. She stopped in front of her mother's bedroom door and listened. A man's voice. Low and even. Her mother's voice, lighter than Claire, had heard it in years. The sound of a page turning. Claire pushed the door open without knocking. Eleanor Whitmore sat propped against a mountain of pillows in her wide four-poster bed, silver hair loose around her shoulders, her face soft and animated in a way that made her look, briefly, like the woman Claire remembered from before. Beside the bed, kneeling on the floor with evident comfort, as though he knelt in this exact spot regularly, was a man Claire did not recognize. He was perhaps 35, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of chronic exhaustion, wearing a plain gray sweatshirt that had been washed too many times. He was holding a book open with one hand, and with the other, he was carefully braiding a thin section of Eleanor's silver hair, his fingers moving with a gentleness so practiced it looked almost habitual. The book, Claire could see, was a dog-eared copy of Jane Austen's Persuasion, her mother's favorite. The spine broken and retaped 3 times over the decades. The man looked up when the door opened. He did not startle. He met Claire's eyes steadily, and she saw in his face neither guilt nor surprise, only the particular tired patience of someone who had dealt with difficult things long enough that one more difficult thing simply joined the queue. Claire stood in the doorway for a moment that stretched into several moments. Then she said, her voice carrying all the coldness she had spent 20 years perfecting, "What are you doing in my mother's room?" Eleanor turned her head and said, "Claire, darling, you're home early." Claire did not look at her mother. She looked at the man on the floor, still holding the book, still halfway through braiding her mother's hair. And she asked the question that had been the organizing principle of her adult life, the question she asked every new presence that appeared near the people and things she was protecting. Her voice was quiet. It was always quieter when she was most serious. "What are you planning to take from my mother?" His name was Daniel Hartley. And he did not answer her question right away. He placed the book carefully face down on the nightstand, finished the small section of braid he had been working on with the focused patience of a man who believed a thing worth starting was worth finishing, and then he stood up from the floor in the slow, careful way of someone whose knees hurt at the end of long days. He was not tall. He was the kind of man who occupied exactly as much space as he needed, and no more, which Claire found, unexpectedly, more unsettling than bluster would have been. He said, "Nothing," and then he said good night to Eleanor, who patted his hand, and he walked past Claire in the doorway with the quiet of a man who had decided, long before this particular evening, that he was not going to be made to feel small in a place where he had only ever tried to be useful. Claire stepped aside. She watched him go down the hallway. She turned back to her mother, who was looking at her with an expression Claire had not seen in years, a kind of patient disappointment. The look of a woman who had hoped for better, and was not entirely surprised to be disappointed. The report from the private investigator Claire hired the next morning took 48 hours to compile. In that time, she learned the following about Daniel Hartley. He was 34 years old, the sole parent of a 6-year-old daughter named Lily, and the widower of a woman named Sarah, who had died of a pulmonary embolism 18 months after Lily was born. He currently held 3 jobs simultaneously: part-time work at a hardware store, freelance carpentry contracts through an app, and weekend shifts at a family diner 3 miles from the Whitmore estate. He had a degree in architecture from a state university that he had not used professionally in 4 years, not since Sarah's illness had consumed their savings, and then her life, and then his career prospects in roughly that order. He rented half of a duplex on the east side of town for $940 a month. He drove a 2008 Toyota Camry with a cracked rear windshield. He had no criminal record, no history of civil litigation, no outstanding warrants. He had, according to the investigator's notes, met Eleanor Whitmore approximately 4 months earlier in Riverside Park. where Eleanor walked on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, and where Lily frequently played on the swings near the fountain. Eleanor had given Lily a piece of butterscotch candy from her coat pocket. Lily had apparently decided on the basis of this transaction that Eleanor was the best person in the park, and had conducted subsequent conversations with her accordingly. Daniel had been polite, then friendly. Then, as Eleanor increasingly appeared at the park alone, and sometimes confused about how to get home quietly helpful, the last line of the investigator's report read, "Subject is currently carrying approximately $62,000 in debt, primarily medical." Claire read that line 3 times. She set the report on her desk, pressed her fingers together, and stared out the window at the garden, where her mother was walking slowly along the stone path with Thomas at her elbow, the two of them moving at the careful pace Eleanor required now on cold mornings when her joints were stiff. Claire thought about the $62,000. She thought about the 3 jobs. She thought about the 8-year-old Toyota with the cracked windshield. She had been right, she told herself. A man that desperate, circling a wealthy woman with early memory problems, the conclusion was obvious. The math was obvious. The motive was obvious. She called her attorney and asked him to prepare a document, a straightforward arrangement, a sum of money, the amount to be negotiated, in exchange for Daniel Hartley removing himself permanently from Eleanor Whitmore's life. Claire had done this before. It was unpleasant and necessary, and usually effective. She expected this to be simple. She arranged to meet him at the estate on Saturday morning. She had Thomas show him into the small study off the entrance hall, not the formal parlor, not the warm sitting room where Eleanor received people she liked, but the study, which was functional and slightly cold, and communicated, by its very plainness, that this was a business conversation and not a social one. Daniel came in wearing the same gray sweatshirt, or one exactly like it, and he sat down across from Claire's desk without being asked, with the posture of a man who had sat across from authority often enough to have stopped being impressed by it. Claire slid the envelope across the desk. She watched him open it, look at the number, and look up at her. "I need you to understand," Claire said, "that this is a generous offer, and that I don't intend to negotiate. My mother is a vulnerable woman, and your continued presence in her life represents a risk I'm not willing to accept." Daniel looked at the number again. He set the envelope back on the desk. "No," he said. Claire had not been told no, in a business context, in approximately 4 years. She felt the word land somewhere in her chest where it did not belong. "Excuse me?" "No," he said again, with the same absolute absence of drama. "I'm not taking money to stop being kind to an old woman who needs company. That's not something I'm willing to do." Claire leaned back in her chair and studied him the way she studied everything that did not behave predictably with complete attention. "Then what do you want?" she asked. "Nothing from you," he said. He stood up, picked up the envelope, set it carefully back in front of her, and left. She doubled the amount and had her attorney contact him formally. He did not respond. She had Thomas monitor Eleanor's visitors more closely and noticed that Daniel came on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, always for less than 90 minutes, always at times when Eleanor was typically most alert and most prone to anxiety if left without company. She began to notice other things too. The small carpentry repairs around the house, a cabinet hinge that had squeaked for 2 years. A cracked windowsill on the second landing had been quietly fixed. The kitchen staff mentioned that he sometimes brought groceries from a market across town that carried Eleanor's preferred brand of chamomile tea, which had become difficult to find locally. He never asked for anything. He never stayed long. He always left the house as he had found it, except for the small improvements that appeared like evidence of a different kind of motive than the one Claire had assigned him. Then she saw him at the hospital. She had gone on a Thursday to meet with her accountant at an office 2 blocks from Mercy General, and she had taken the wrong exit from the parking garage and come out near the pediatric entrance, and there he was, Daniel, sitting in a plastic chair in the hallway outside a treatment room, still in the clothes he'd been wearing when he presumably arrived, head tilted back against the wall. Asleep. Not the light, performative sleep of someone playing at exhaustion. The deep, helpless sleep of someone who had been running on empty for so long that their body had simply surrendered without asking permission. There was a paper cup of coffee on the floor beside his chair, long cold. His hands, even in sleep, were restless, opening and closing slowly, as though working through a problem. On the plastic chair beside him sat a small pink backpack with a cartoon rabbit stitched to the front, half unzipped, a picture book, and a folded drawing visible inside, the careful preparation of a father who had packed comfort items in advance because he knew this day was coming, and he wanted his daughter to have the things she loved within reach. Claire stood in the hallway for longer than she meant to. A nurse passed, glanced at Daniel, and did not wake him either, the small professional mercy of someone who recognized a person who had earned whatever rest they could get. Claire was late for her appointment. She left without waking him, and she spent the rest of the afternoon sitting across from her accountant while an entirely different set of numbers ran through her head, not quarterly projections, not merger valuations, but the simple arithmetic of a man who worked 3 jobs and still could not make it add up. Eleanor told her on a Sunday evening, in the kitchen over tea, quietly and without preamble, the way she communicated things that she had been waiting a long time to say. The doctor had confirmed the diagnosis 8 months ago: early-stage cognitive decline. The slow theft of memory that began with small lapses and moved, over years or decades, towards something no one in this house was ready to contemplate. Eleanor had not told Claire immediately. She had told Thomas, who had told her that he would keep the information in confidence unless her safety required otherwise. And he had. Eleanor told Claire now because Claire was home, and because Claire was looking at Daniel the wrong way, and because Eleanor had spent 64 years observing people, and she recognized a misunderstanding when she was living inside one. "He has never asked me for a single thing," Eleanor said, holding her cup in both hands. "Not money, not favors, not introductions. He comes, he reads to me, he fixes the things I forget, are broken. He makes sure I've taken my tablets. And then he goes home to that child." She paused. "I have watched many men approach this family looking for something. I know what that looks like, Claire. This is not what that looks like." Claire looked into her tea. "You're vulnerable," she said. "That's not a criticism. It's just I'm also not an idiot," Eleanor said, and her voice was gentle but final, the way it had always been when she was absolutely certain of something. Not yet. The next morning, Claire asked Thomas privately what he had observed over the 4 months of Daniel's visits. Thomas, who was constitutionally incapable of dishonesty with the Whitmore family, told her with his usual careful precision. Daniel had never entered any room of the house without Eleanor's invitation or Thomas's accompaniment. He had never asked questions about the estate's finances or property. He had once, when Eleanor had become confused during a particularly difficult afternoon, sat with her for 3 hours talking about her garden until she was calm again. And then he had called Thomas to let him know she'd had a difficult day before he left. Thomas folded his hands and said, "In 19 years with this family, Miss Whitmore, I have observed a great many people in this house. Mr. Hartley is not what you think he is." Claire nodded once, dismissed Thomas with a look, and stood at the kitchen window watching the frost on the garden for a long time. Somewhere inside the tight architecture of her certainty, something shifted, not dramatically, not completely, but enough to leave a crack through which other possibilities could begin, however reluctantly, to enter. She found out about the house on a Wednesday, not from Daniel, not from any person who knew him from a property listing that her assistant had flagged as part of a routine neighborhood property review the estate's attorneys conducted quarterly. The address was 43 Birchwood Lane, a small Cape Cod, in a modest neighborhood, 15 minutes from the Whitmore estate. It was listed at $212,000. The listing agent was Daniel Hartley. The listing description noted the property was being sold in as-is condition and that the seller was seeking a quick close. The investigator confirmed what Claire had already begun to suspect. Daniel had been on a waiting list for Lily's cardiac procedure, a valve repair that her cardiologist had been monitoring since birth and which had now become urgent for 11 months. The cost, after the portion covered by his limited insurance, was $118,000. He had saved $31,000. He had borrowed what he could from the credit available to a man with 3 part-time jobs and an architecture degree he hadn't used in 4 years. The house, the only significant asset he owned, The house he had bought with Sarah before Lily was born. The house he had fixed and improved and paid into for 6 years was the remainder. He had calculated it down to the dollar. The sale would cover the gap, with approximately $4,000 left over. He had arranged to move Lily into a rented room in a colleague's house after the sale. He had arranged this without telling anyone, without complaint, without asking for help from the woman whose mother he visited twice a week and whose floors he had regrouted in the downstairs bathroom without mentioning it to anyone. Claire sat in her car in the parking lot of the property management firm for 11 minutes after the investigator's call ended. She was not a woman who cried. She had not cried since her father's funeral. And even then she had waited until she was alone, in the car, on the way home from the cemetery. She did not cry now, but something in her chest was doing something that felt adjacent to it. Something she didn't have the vocabulary for because she'd spent 20 years making sure the vocabulary remained unnecessary. On the drive home, she passed the street where the hardware store was. She did not stop, but she slowed down, just slightly, without meaning to. That evening, restless and unable to concentrate on the documents open on her laptop, she drove without a clear destination and found herself in the hospital district. She pulled into the parking structure near the pediatric wing out of a compulsion she couldn't fully articulate. In the row nearest the exit, she recognized the 2008 Camry with the cracked rear windshield. She almost drove past. Instead, she parked 2 spaces over and sat for a moment, and then she saw him through the fogged glass, Daniel in the driver's seat, upright this time, awake, eating instant noodles cold from a paper cup with a plastic fork, the kind you found in a convenience store, the kind that tasted of nothing and cost 99 cents. And he was eating them slowly and methodically in the dark of the parking structure, because he had not had time to stop somewhere real, or because somewhere real would have cost more, or both. He did not see her. He looked out the windshield at the concrete pillar in front of his car, eating his cold noodles with the patient endurance of a man who had decided that self-pity was a luxury he had not budgeted for. Claire drove home. She sat in the driveway for a long time before she went inside. She went to see him at the hardware store on a Thursday evening, 40 minutes before his shift ended. She waited in the parking lot because she was not going to walk the aisles of a hardware store having this conversation in front of customers and colleagues. He came out at 7, saw her car, and stopped for a moment before he walked over and got in the passenger seat without being asked, because she was learning, a man who got on with things. She told him she knew about the house. He looked at the dashboard. She told him she wanted to pay for Lily's surgery. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, with the same measured patience he brought to everything, "No." Claire pressed her eyes closed briefly. "Daniel," she said. And it was the first time she had used his first name, and she heard herself use it, and noted the way it felt different from Mr. Hartley, less armor, less distance. "I'm not doing this because I feel sorry for you. I'm doing this because you feel guilty," he said. Not unkindly, just accurately. The word landed. Claire looked at the windshield. Outside, the parking lot lights hummed orange in the dark. "Maybe," she said. He said, "People like you and I don't mean that as an insult. I mean people who have what you have. You solve things with money, because that's the tool you've got. I'm not a problem that needs solving." "She's a child," Claire said. Her voice was quieter than she meant it to be. "She's my child," he said. "And I'm handling it." He got out of the car. He walked across the parking lot toward the battered Camry without looking back. Claire sat in the parking lot until the hardware store's lights went out. 2 weeks later, Eleanor fainted in the upstairs hallway. Thomas found her and called Claire before he called the ambulance, which was the correct order of priority for a man who understood that Claire Whitmore needed to hear news firsthand, or she spent the subsequent hours certain that the truth was being managed. The ambulance arrived at the Whitmore estate at 2:17 in the afternoon on a Tuesday. Claire was in a board meeting when her phone lit up with Thomas's name, and she walked out of the room in the middle of a sentence, which she had never done before in 20 years of board meetings, and which caused the remaining board members to sit in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. She was at the hospital in 40 minutes. Eleanor was conscious, pale, and embarrassed by the fuss, and her cardiologist, said it was a blood pressure episode consistent with her recent history and that she would need to be monitored overnight. Claire sat in the chair beside the hospital bed and held her mother's hand, which she could not recall doing since childhood, and tried to remember how to simply be present without managing or controlling or solving. She was not very good at it, but she was trying. Daniel arrived at the hospital at 4:30. He had learned from Lily, who had learned from Eleanor at the park 2 days earlier, that Eleanor's blood pressure had been giving her trouble, and he had apparently made a mental note and acted on it. He came in quietly, stood at the door, looked at Eleanor, and looked at Claire. "How is she?" he asked. "Stable," Claire said. He nodded. He found a second chair and pulled it to the other side of Eleanor's bed, without asking whether he was wanted, which Claire found she did not, in fact, mind. Eleanor opened her eyes and saw both of them and said, "Good, now I don't have to feel guilty about the fuss." They sat on opposite sides of Eleanor's bed for 2 hours while Eleanor drifted in and out of sleep. At some point, in the dim light of the hospital room, with the equipment humming softly and Eleanor's breathing slow and regular, Daniel said, without looking at Claire, "I know you were just trying to protect her." Claire looked at her mother's sleeping face. "I know," she said. "That doesn't mean I wasn't wrong." Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside the window, the city moved through its evening routines, indifferent and continuous. Daniel said, quietly, "Sarah, my wife. She used to say that I was too proud to let people in. She was right. I'm still working on it." Claire said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "I think I'm the opposite. I let people in, and then I find out what they want. And eventually you stop wanting to find out." "That sounds lonely," he said. "Yes," she said. It was the most honest word she had said to anyone in years. Eleanor woke up at 6, ate half a bowl of soup, and looked between the two of them with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had arranged something that she intended to claim no credit for. "Daniel," she said, "has Lily eaten?" He checked his phone, smiled slightly, the small, tight smile of a parent receiving a photo they had been waiting for. "Thomas is with her," he said. "At your house," he added, to Claire, which was information Claire had not been given and which produced in her an unexpected warmth rather than the territorial alarm she might have expected. Eleanor patted her daughter's hand. "The thing I have always been most afraid of," she said to Claire, with the careful clarity she sometimes found in the evenings when her mind was sharp, "was never illness. It was watching you grow old and not know how to let anyone love you." Claire looked at the wall. She breathed. "I'm still learning," she said. The crisis at the company arrived the following Monday, and it arrived the way significant things tend to, not through a single dramatic event, but through the accumulation of smaller things that had been building while Claire's attention was elsewhere. A competitor had been circulating information in the financial press, partially true, partially extrapolated, entirely designed to destabilize, suggesting that Claire's logistics company was overextended in its European expansion, that the Swiss merger had been finalized on unfavorable terms, that 2 key board members were considering a vote of no confidence. By Wednesday, the company's shares had dropped 9%. By Thursday, Claire had received 3 calls from board members she had considered allies who were now using the careful, diplomatic language of people who were beginning to recalculate their positions. She managed the crisis from her home office with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had spent 20 years preparing for exactly this scenario. But the efficiency was covering something she had less practice managing, the particular exhaustion of fighting on every front simultaneously, of being strong for the company, and strong at the hospital, and strong for her mother, and strong in every room she entered, until she was sitting in her car outside the estate at 11 on a Thursday night, unable to make herself go inside. She didn't hear Daniel's car pull up. She heard the knock on her passenger window, and looked up to find him standing in the driveway, his breath visible in the cold air, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner 3 miles away. She rolled the window down. He handed her a cup. "Thomas texted," he said. She stared at the coffee. "You came here because Thomas texted you? He said you'd been sitting in the car for 40 minutes. Claire closed her eyes. She was aware that she was, in this moment, completely exhausted, completely stripped of the careful composure she had maintained for 2 decades, and being looked at by a man who was probably the least impressed by her money and her titles and her reputation of anyone she had ever encountered, and that this was somehow, inexplicably, the least threatening thing she had felt in years. "I don't know how to ask for help," she said. "I've noticed," he said. He got into the passenger seat without being asked, which was a habit of his that she realized, no longer finding presumptuous. They sat in the driveway with their coffee. And he told her about the time after Sarah died, when he had been so determined to handle everything alone that he had gone 3 months without telling anyone that he was struggling, until Lily had asked him why he looked so sad all the time. And the question from a 4-year-old had undone something in him that 3 months of willpower hadn't touched. "Lily came to see your mother yesterday," he said. "She drew her a picture of the garden." Claire turned to look at him. "She told me," she said. She said Lily called her Grandma Eleanor. Something moved across Daniel's face, something complicated, tender, and slightly undone. "Yeah," he said. "She does that." Outside the car. The first snow of the season had begun, not the serious snow of deep winter, but the tentative early snow that the sky tries out in November, light and uncertain, landing on the driveway and disappearing almost immediately. They watched it fall. Inside the estate, warm light glowed from Eleanor's bedroom window. The following Saturday, Daniel brought Lily to the estate, and something about the morning rearranged itself around the child's presence in a way that nothing in the past month had managed to do. Lily was 6 and specific. She had opinions about the color of everything, the correct pronunciation of the word particularly, and the structural integrity of the Whitmore estate's kitchen cabinets, which she tested by hanging from the handles, until Daniel said her name once, quietly, and she let go and looked at him and grinned, with the particular fearlessness of a child who knows she is loved. Eleanor sat at the kitchen table and watched with the luminous attentiveness she reserved for things that mattered. Claire stood at the counter and tried to remember the last time she had simply stood in a kitchen without a phone in her hand. Lily announced that they were going to make a cake, and that Claire was going to help, and that the cake was going to have strawberries on it, because strawberries were the best thing. Claire looked at Daniel, who looked back at her with an expression that said, simply, "This is what she is like. And also, I dare you." Claire put down her phone. She found a mixing bowl. She followed Lily's instructions for measuring flour, which were confident and almost entirely incorrect, and the batter ended up with too much sugar and not enough salt, and the cake emerged from the oven slightly lopsided, and, when they tasted it, completely delicious. Lily ate 2 pieces and got frosting on Eleanor's sleeve and apologized with complete insincerity. Eleanor laughed, the real laugh, the one Claire had heard from her mother's room the night she came home from Geneva, and it filled the kitchen the way warmth fills a room when someone finally lights the fire. Later, when Lily had fallen asleep on the sitting room couch with Eleanor's reading blanket tucked around her, and Eleanor had gone upstairs to rest, Claire and Daniel sat at the kitchen table with the remains of the cake between them, and Claire said, "Her surgery. The date is set?" Daniel looked at his hands. 3 weeks, he said. "The house closes in 2. I want to help," Claire said. He started to say something. "Not as charity," she said. "Not because I feel guilty. Because she is a child and she is." She stopped. "She called me the rich fairy," she said. Daniel looked up. "Yeah," he said. "She told me. I don't want to be the rich fairy," Claire said. "I want to be something real." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the snow had stopped, and the afternoon light fell through the window in long, cold lines across the table between them. Daniel was quiet for a long time. "Okay," he said. The surgery was scheduled for a Tuesday. It was a cold morning. The sky white and heavy. The kind of morning that asks nothing of you, except presence. Claire had driven Daniel and Lily to Mercy General at 6:30, Lily wearing a purple hat with a pom-pom that she had apparently selected with great deliberation the previous evening. In the hospital bay, before the nurses took Lily through the double doors, Lily grabbed Claire's hand with both of hers, the grip of a child who is slightly more afraid than she has let on, and said, "Will you be here when I wake up?" Claire looked at her. She looked at Daniel, who was watching her with an expression she could not read and did not need to. "Yes," Claire said. I'll be right here. Lily studied her face for a moment with the evaluating seriousness of a very small child who has learned to read honesty, and then she nodded and let the nurses take her hand instead, and walked through the double doors with the purple pom-pom bouncing at the back of her hat. The waiting was 5 hours. Claire had never been good at waiting. She had spent 20 years converting waiting time into productive time. Phone calls, reports, decisions made, problems solved. She sat in the plastic chair outside the cardiac surgical suite and did not open her laptop and did not make phone calls and did not solve anything. She sat with Daniel, who had his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped and his eyes forward, and she understood for the first time that being present in difficulty was its own form of strength, not the strength of managing or controlling, but the strength of simply remaining. Eleanor had insisted on coming. She sat on Daniel's other side, small and upright in her good coat, her hand resting on his forearm, saying nothing. At some point in the 3rd hour, without planning it or thinking about it, Claire reached over and put her hand over Daniel's clasped hands, and he looked at her sideways and didn't say anything. And she didn't say anything, and they sat like that through the rest of the waiting. The surgeon came out at 12:40, with good news delivered in the measured, professional tone of someone who understood that measured tones were what families needed after 5 hours of fear. The procedure had gone well. Lily was in recovery. She would need rest and careful monitoring over the following weeks, but the prognosis was excellent. Daniel pressed his face into his hands and shook, just once, the full weight of months of carrying everything alone releasing in a single, involuntary motion. Eleanor put her arm around him. Claire looked at the wall and breathed and let the relief move through her like weather. She thought about the paperwork she had signed that morning before coming to the hospital, the documents her attorney had prepared, the holding structure, the investment in a business that would carry Daniel's name and not hers, and she felt, for perhaps the first time, that she had done something with money that had nothing to do with leverage or protection or the careful maintenance of distance. She had done something simply because it was the right size and shape to fit the moment. And the moment had mattered more than the strategy. They were allowed in to see Lily at 2 o'clock. She was small against the white pillows, drowsy from the anesthetic, the purple pom-pom hat sitting on the bedside table because the nurses had let her keep it close. She looked at Daniel for a long time with the unfocused tenderness of someone returning from a long way away. Then she looked at Claire. "You stayed," Lily said. Her voice was slow and a little rough. "I stayed," Claire said. Lily reached out a hand, not quite coordinated yet, and Claire took it, and they sat like that, Daniel on one side, Claire on the other. Eleanor in the chair by the window with her coat still on, watching her daughter hold a child's hand in a hospital room, and looking, very quietly, like someone whose longest worry had finally been answered. Lily came home Daniel's rented room in his colleague's house, temporarily 2 weeks before Christmas. She was smaller in convalescence than she had seemed before, and quieter. But her eyes retained their evaluating brightness, and she had strong opinions about the holiday decorations and where specifically the tinsel should go. Eleanor visited every Tuesday. Claire visited more often than she had announced she would, arriving with books, with strawberries, with the slightly awkward generosity of someone learning a new language and making grammatical errors and continuing anyway. She brought a second-hand set of watercolor paints once, because she had seen a box of broken crayons on Lily's windowsill and thought something better was warranted, and Lily had received them with the solemnity of an artist accepting a commission and had immediately painted Claire's portrait, which featured a woman in a tall black hat who was smiling with enormous teeth, and which Claire had taken home and placed on her desk at the company where she could see it during conference calls. The company survived its crisis, which is to say Claire outmaneuvered the leak, addressed the board with the methodical precision of someone who had spent decades preparing arguments, and retained the positions of the allies she had decided were worth retaining. The share price recovered. The merger proved, over the following quarter, to have been as strategically sound as she had always believed it to be. She ran the company with the same intelligence she always had, but the way she ran it changed slightly, incrementally, in ways that her staff noticed before she did. She began delegating in earnest. She began leaving at a reasonable hour. She began asking questions in meetings rather than delivering conclusions. The cafe was Daniel's idea, and it began the way his best ideas seemed to quietly, practically, without fanfare. He had talked about it to Lily, who had enthusiastically approved, and to Eleanor, who had said she wanted a corner table permanently reserved, and to Claire, who had listened and then said nothing for 3 days, and then called her attorney and arranged the investment through a holding structure that kept her name entirely off the paperwork. Daniel found out anyway. He called her on a Tuesday evening and said her name once, just Claire, and she said, "I know, and I'm not apologizing." And there was a long pause, and then he said, "Thank you." It was the first time he had thanked her for anything. And it cost him something to say it. And she understood the cost. And she received it accordingly. The cafe opened on the first Saturday of March, when the cold was still present, but the light had begun to change the longer, cleaner light of early spring that falls differently than winter light, that carries in it some implication of forward motion. It was called Hartley's, in white letters on a dark green awning, on a corner 2 blocks from Riverside Park, where Eleanor and Lily had first met, which Daniel had chosen deliberately and had not explained to anyone. The interior was warm amber light, wooden tables, a corner reading area with a low shelf of books and 2 armchairs angled toward each other, and it smelled of coffee and something baking, as the morning filled with people, of the particular warmth that a room generates when it contains people who are genuinely glad to be there. Daniel had built the shelving himself, working evenings in the weeks before the opening, the wood pale and clean, and fitted with the precision of someone who had trained for a different life, and was finding, perhaps, that the training had followed him to this one. The chalkboard menu behind the counter was in Lily's handwriting, uneven letters, enthusiastically capitalized. The prices slightly misaligned, and Daniel had refused to correct it, and it was the first thing people noticed when they came through the door, and every single person who noticed it smiled. Eleanor sat at her corner table. Lily, recovered and restored, and wearing a red dress she had selected herself on the grounds that red was the correct color for important occasions, circulated among the guests with the purposeful confidence of a child who considered herself a co-host. She had made a drawing in the previous week crayon, on a large piece of paper taken from Daniel's architecture, supplies that she had presented to Daniel the morning before, with the ceremony appropriate to a significant gift. It showed 4 figures in front of a building with a green awning: a tall man, a small girl, a woman in a suit, and an older woman in a coat. Underneath, in the careful block letters of a child who was still learning, she had written, "Family." Daniel had put it in a frame. It hung beside the cafe entrance, at child height, which was where Lily had specified it should go. In the late morning, when the cafe was full and the coffee was running steadily, and Lily had found a child her own age among the guests, and was engaged in an elaborate negotiation about something involving the bookshelf, Claire found herself standing near the window with a cup of coffee she hadn't tasted yet, watching the street where the first suggestions of spring were visible, in the way people moved coats still on but unbuttoned, faces turning slightly upward, the collective unconscious recognition that the long cold was ending. Daniel came to stand beside her. He had flour on his sleeve from something that had happened in the kitchen an hour ago and had apparently not yet been addressed. He stood beside her and looked out at the same street she was looking at. Inside the cafe, Eleanor's laugh carried over the noise of the room, real, warm. The laugh that sounded like before. Lily shrieked with the pure, unqualified joy of a child at play. The amber light held everything. "This is good," Claire said, not to the room, not to the cafe, not to the morning, just to the air between them, which had, over the preceding months, become a different kind of space than it once was. Daniel looked at her sideways, the particular look she had come to recognize as his version of a smile, slight, unhurried, as certain as he was about things he had thought through and decided. Outside, the snow that had been forecast had begun to fall light and soft, the kind that melts on contact with warmer ground, that exists more as gesture than accumulation. Lily looked up from across the room and pointed at the window with an expression of pure delight. Eleanor turned to look. The snowflakes drifted past the green awning and disappeared before they reached the pavement, and inside the cafe the warmth held, and the light held, and the sound of the family held, imperfect and assembled from unlikely parts, made of loss and stubbornness, and accumulated small kindnesses, and a child's drawing in a frame by the door. And whatever this was, whatever it was becoming, it was real. It was the most real thing in any room Claire Whitmore had occupied in 20 years of building things she could measure and defend and value in dollar amounts. She looked at the street, at the falling snow, at the green awning, at the small figure of Lily pressed to the window, with both hands flat on the glass. "Maybe," Claire said. And she was remembering the night in the rain, the open door, the man kneeling on the floor beside her mother's bed with a book, and a patience she had not understood yet. Maybe this is what home actually is. Daniel said nothing, but he did not move away from the window, and in the warmth of the room they had all, in their separate and wandering ways, somehow found their way toward. Eleanor Whitmore looked at her daughter and smiled the smile of a woman who had known something for a long time and was glad, finally, to see it known.